And I was told to really plug the talk tomorrow, and Winnie Chung, who is behind the organization, asked me to give it a plug tonight, and I think she was feeling a little bit jealous of this event because this is an event that's really attracting a lot of people. And one of the things that Winnie said to me, well, you know, it's such a sexy event. Three Chinese laundry kids, and I must confess that if my father were alive, that somebody should attach the adjective sexy to his labor. It was really kind of just a bit beyond my comprehension. So that tells you how far we have come. We have come from looking at clothes perhaps as something that was despised to now to being actually sexy. I'm not going to speak for very long because you people have all been extremely patient, and you know, you've had two wonderful speakers already. And I also have to confess that I'm really quite surprised to see all these pictures from my website, you know, being flashed upon the screen. Because one of the things that happened was that Jacqueline called me yesterday and asked me if I had any pictures from my father's laundry, and I guess of course she was thinking of Elwin, who obviously was from a very privileged laundry because he had a camera. My family, we didn't even have a camera, much less pictures, my God. And the other thing that I was asked was if I had any pictures that were digital. And I thought, digital? This was in the 50s and the 60s. The most I could have come up with, if I even had a camera, would have been a brownie camera. Remember those? Well, I guess I really do approach this much more from an emotional point of view, and I think that that's what comes of storytelling, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, such as this memoir. And because this is a sexy laundry kid night, I'm going to read about this very sexy labor that my father used to perform. And it will only take me a few minutes. My father's routine from one week to the next never varied. And my mother fell quickly into the rhythm of his work. We would have just arrived at this point. My mother and I came to Canada in 1955. My father actually first came to Canada in 1914. He was one of the ones who paid the head tax, and he went back and forth between China and Canada about 5 or 6 times. And he had a family with his first wife. And then he went back after the war and married my mother. And while my mother was pregnant with me, he actually came back to Canada. So when my mother and I came to Canada, we joined him. On Saturdays and Wednesdays, my parents each sat on a stool and sorted dirty clothes according to light and dark. They turned all the socks inside out and inspected underwear for stains. On Mondays and Thursdays, my father started the morning by lighting the small coal-burning furnace at the base of the boiler. Within an hour, hot water flowed from the taps. On other days, we heated water in a large pot on the cast-iron stove. Whatever amount we ladled out for washing our faces and for dishes had to be immediately replaced. Wash days were especially busy, my parents hurrying from one chore to another. Sorted piles of dirty clothes sat on the floor at one end of the room. Giant wicker baskets waited for wet laundry at the other, and off in a corner, pails of starch for the collars and cuffs of well-made shirts stood ready. My father opened the metal and wooden doors to the barrel-shaped receptacle and stuffed it with soiled laundry. When he turned on the electric motor, the grinding of gears and the sloshing of water were so loud it was almost impossible to speak and be heard. On these days, I crouched by the edge of the metal pan and watched the water as it gushed from the tail-like hose, swirling around the drain. Then, without warning, I heard my father singing long, mournful notes from some Chinese opera, his voice rising above the dreadful cacophony. But the lyrics were in classical Chinese, unlike the language we spoke in our home. For me, the words were incomprehensible. As soon as the song was finished, the corners of his mouth turned down in grim determination. My father rushed between the machine and the wooden tubs where the soapy laundry was rinsed in one tub after another until the water was clear. Next, he fed the clothes piece by piece between the rollers of a hand-cranked mangle that squeezed out all the water. The wrung-out laundry fell from the mangle in graceful undulating curves into a wicker basket. If the weather was fine, my father hung each wet item on lines outside. At the end of the day, there were baskets stuffed with dried shirts, sheets, towels, underwear, and socks, everything stiff and smelling of the sun and fresh air. But on rainy days and during the winter, my father went into a room at the back of the building and packed coal into a cast iron furnace that stood in the corner, heating the room to more than 80 degrees. He then took the wrung-out clothes and pegged everything on clotheslines strung just below the ceiling. When it was cold outside, I used to stand in that room dressed only in panties and an undershirt, just to savor its moisture and warmth. Even on the coldest winter day, he had to open the back door, releasing clouds of billowing steam into the frosty air outside. On those rainy summer days, however, the hot furnace only added to the already high temperatures. The laundry filled with humidity, and my father, dressed in dark trousers and a flimsy white singlet, dripped with perspiration. In the winter, except for Mondays and Thursdays, when laundry was being washed, my father put off burning coal in the cast iron stove for as long as possible, and he bundled up with a peaked cap and a bulky shawl-collared woolen sweater fitted over many layers of clothing. Every Tuesday and Friday, he stood from morning until night in front of his ironing table. He ironed every single article by hand, except for bed sheets, which he later put through a press with rollers. By the time my mother and I joined him, he had bought himself an electric iron. But when he first worked in a laundry, he used heavy ones that had to be warmed on the top of a cold stove. "You have to be careful," he often told me, "because if the metal is too hot, you will scorch the shirt." He said the Lofons grew very angry when an item of clothing was ruined, even when he offered to reimburse them. I protested and answered that the Lofons were unfair. My father shook his head and said that these accidents no longer happened. He always remembered to test the electric iron first on the cloth that was stretched over the padded surface of the table. And he pointed to a strip along the white sheet where arrow-shaped burn marks overlapped one another. On ironing days before I started school and got to know other children in the neighborhood, I used to play in the space under my father's ironing table and watched his trousered legs shuffle back and forth. It was a space that was mine. Somewhere I could create a world of my own, my parents close, yet far away. I drew on sheets of brown laundry paper, cut out shapes, listened to the hiss of steam, and felt the thud-glide rhythm of my father's iron pounding the padded wooden surface above my head. And I will stop there.